So hey anime fans. The series name is What If Naruto Got Harem with High School DxD. So let's start the series. The crumbling white paint was punctured by his vacant eyes. She was not dangerous because she had been there all night, but he knew she was there because he heard rustling next to him. He heard her go back to the bathroom, change into her panties, and begin to brush her teeth. It took him some time to overcome the psychological effect of breathing something different than oxygen, like breathing underwater. Pale fingers brought the stick of poison to his lips, and he drew it. He ignored all the warning signs on the package because he believed it wouldn't affect him anyhow. He swirled the smoke in his mouth, waiting a little longer than necessary for it to enter his lungs. It tasted terrible. How could anyone like the taste of ground-up home chemicals sprayed over dried twigs or onto paper? It was hot and dry, but he was aware that he didn't have a headache. It was pleasant to feel the heat burn in his chest. As he inhaled, the smoke drifted into his nostrils, and the odor was foul. How appropriate that he can still remember the smell from that day after breathing in something so terrible. Naruto. Slowly, the dead blue, almost gray eyes turned to the other person in the room. A brown-haired girl stood there looking lovely. Her nose was too small for her eyes, and her face was striated with freckles and concealed cosmetics, giving her a raccoon-like appearance. With a tentative smile, she asked him, "Where did you say you put the money again?" He forced himself not to sigh, shut his eerily empty eyes, took one last drag from his cigarette, and then combed his long, shaggy pale blonde hair with his fingers, before putting it in the ashtray beside his bed. He had to do something about it, or more accurately, he needed a haircut. His hair was no longer oily, but as long as it didn't bother him, he was content with the way it looked. The fact that it was fashionable no longer mattered to him. He came close to snorting. He got up for the day, stretched his legs, and went icily past the girl in the room, ignoring the chill air on his nude body. After searching his tidy but dilapidated apartment, he finally located his wallet, a plain black wallet, and took out a few bucks, laying them on the counter, without bothering to give them to her. He passed her once more and went to the fridge to get a drink. He picked out a brown bottle and pried off the metal cap with his own hands. He swallowed the bitter drink and felt the burn of a learned taste. Drinking so early. He sipped again and turned to face his partner, who was now dressed and tucking his money into his purse. She appeared dissatisfied with him, one hand on her hip. "Ah, it looked nice out," he said, looking out his kitchen window. With a groan, she took the beer bottle out of his grasp and drank some for herself. He just stared at her, watching her. She then returned the bottle to him. "You're hopeless, you know that." He responded with a grunt, drained his hand of the remaining vodka, and set the bottle next to his sink. He left the girl in his room after that and started to go to his restroom, but he was momentarily stopped when a gentle hand gently grabbed his wrist. He didn't turn to face her. "We'll do this next month, yeah." She had been living on the streets, giving herself to anyone who would accept her, a lost soul shattered by the world. It had been almost a year since he first met her. Naruto had just come up to her, handed her a large amount of cash, and told her to come to his house once a month. He was always paid in advance, and he would pay for her taxi the next morning. He actually looked over his shoulder at her now, and although she seemed hopeful, she was also sad. He could see the underlying layer in her stare, even though he was not conscious of it. He didn't even know her name. She just knew his because it was on his mailbox. It wasn't romantic. It was just two souls in need of a little physical respite from whatever it was they were both dealing with. She never asked him any questions, and he never gave her any explanations. It was better that way, so she didn't want him to inquire, and he reciprocated. He partially turned to face her, his eyes darting to her hand and back again, as though she were about to be attacked. She did this each time she thought she had gone too far, and he could tell she was anxious. It was pitiful. "Yes, next month," he nodded simply at her. Naruto turned and left after she let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding, and gave him a subtle smile. As he heard her say goodbye and open his apartment door, he remained silent. But has he done this before? Indeed, he has. He studied his face, noting the small hair developing on his chin, and the three dead-looking whisker-like marks on each cheek. He thought they had been much darker in the past, but he wasn't sure he could prove it now. The white hair hanging in front of his eyes might need to be straightened. Using the scissors he kept near the kitchen sink, he cut a portion of his bangs to the proper length. Now that he could see clearly, he nodded. Although his hair was too short for a ponytail and was undoubtedly long, unkempt and uneven, he could feel it touching the nape of his neck. He didn't mind that his ears were covered. He went into his shower and showered fast and effectively. This is when homeroom would have begun, he thought as he glanced at the clock. Because of the inconvenience, he considered missing today, but because there wasn't anything particularly noteworthy to do, maybe other than creating more memories, he reasoned, "Oh, sensei is going to chew him out again." He hurried to his room and changed into his easily accessible and inexpensive school uniform, and a simple white t-shirt. Naruto retrieved his backpack and packed numerous shuriken and kunai into various secret holsters. No one ever questioned the series of seals he had engraved on his left forearm, as to the average person they would look like tribal tattoos. Every item that these seals carried was either significant to him or something he cared deeply about. His previous headband was in one of the seals on the palm of his left hand. He took out his pack, took a cigarette from it, and began to go to school. While traveling to Kuo Academy, his thoughts drifted. He definitely shouldn't have smoked another one so quickly, but he had kind of developed this as a coping mechanism, the most socially acceptable way to remind himself that he was still alive. He had come bleeding and defeated, having killed Kagaya 3 years earlier, but he had not won the war. No, he had not won anything. Naruto had crashed on the streets, gasping for air, and no one had come to his aid as he crawled into an alley. He gradually recovered while bystanders chose to ignore him. The store owner, who picked up the trash every night, had once expelled him and urged him to stop bothering the neighborhood. What a filthy place. His wounds had been so bad that they had killed him. He could still remember how sore he was when he stood up straight, stretched, and left the alley. He was filthy, odorous, and broken. He scarcely had the energy to leave the alley, much less look for something more sustaining. He got all of his food from the trash next to him. Though it was slightly different, he was shocked to find that this planet seemed to speak the same language as him. He never really paid attention to his accent, though, after realizing he was the odd one out. He had staggered off, determined to learn more about this region and improve his accent. He had arrived in Japan, a huge country with a wide variety of nationalities, races, and religions. His reality was a larger globe, and he was still in awe of its richness, despite the fact that it was far more violent. The simplest explanation is that, although he had closed his mind to the hairy beast and didn't want to talk about him, he was still able to access Kurama's core energy. How could he tell his partner and buddy how completely he had failed? He was unable to. Therefore, he didn't. Naruto was in a town called Kuo Town, which is an intriguing name. The location itself was pretty large, perhaps a little smaller than Hyde Village, and he had heard about the money, which they called yen. It was a lot like his Ryo world. His shadow clones were a big help in gathering information. Although they are now extinct, ninja and shinobi formerly lived on this planet. Known as assassins or killers, the ninja in Japan, who wielded kunai and shuriken, seemed to be strictly taste-spread art practitioners who were unaware of any otherworldly abilities. The United States of America, a global power, effectively destroyed Japan's military, which they called a defense force. Despite their similarities, the ninjas of this universe were very different from those of Naruto. He discovered that his greatest need was money. The basis of this world was money. It was more about who you knew and how you performed in the world than it was about your strength and who could beat you. This was a totally different society from the one he was used to. He felt sorry that he had tried to live in a separate world, but there was nothing he could do about it. He was not psychologically incapable of ending his own life. It's easy to die, but difficult to live, they say. He was tired of murder and bloodshed, and his eyes adjusted to his surroundings, before he realized he was at the school door. God, he had hated this place. Fortunately, classes had begun, so no one was walking around the campus. Kuo Academy. He was in his final year at the esteemed institution of his elementary, middle, high, and university education. He might be held back this time. He would need to demonstrate that he had no intention of returning by making a substantial improvement in his grades. His younger self would shout in shock and disdain, not because he hated the school or the lessons in general. He used to detest school and would much rather play or practice outside. It's a pleasant diversion from the monotony and routine of civilian life, and he's now quite objective. It appeared as though he lived in a grey world where only black and white were present. The individuals at the academy were what he hated the most. He detested the children, many of whom were engrossed in their own little worlds, and thought they owned the sky. Please give him some space. He interrupted the principal's good luck speech because he was understandably late for the opening ceremony on his first day of school. He went over to a single chair and immediately collapsed on it, closing his eyes in exhaustion. Even though it wasn't his fault, he had to work twice the previous evening, which was sure to cause some rumors. There was a gorgeous woman beside him. She turned and said, "He smells like cigarettes, so gross," at him. Then, with a look he had seen often as a child, she pushed her chair away from him. Given his scruffy appearance, tattoos, blonde hair, and unkempt clothes, they dismissed him right away as a delinquent, tch. In 2 minutes, he had already established himself. He just wanted to finish this whole thing and get away from these men. Naturally, his reputation as a miscreant had caused many to choose to put him in his place. Students tried to physically attack him in an attempt to assert their authority over someone they believed to be totally beneath them. What a filthy place. After a week of the assault, Naruto tried to ignore it and go about his normal high school life. After a week, he became easily agitated, and it only took one attempt to get the other students to stop making fun of him. When they tried to rob him of money for lunch, he crushed their arms. Since then, they haven't touched him, at least not physically. Since they thought that Naruto wouldn't retaliate if they didn't break a barrier, they simply used verbal abuse, which he could also endure with ease. Oh look, it's him again. The stupidest one of us. It's the delinquent. SSSSSH, he'll hear us and beat us up. What a piece of shit. How could anyone act the way he does? He's so gross. I heard he works for the Yakuza. He doesn't care. An asshole, that's what he is. I heard he's an orphan. I bet he killed his parents. If I were his mother, I think I'd rather just kill myself than have him as a son. Maybe that's what happened. His dad probably raped his mom, and she just left him. He's a monster. He was initially taken aback by how sinister some of their whispers could become, but he immediately ignored it, as he always does, and carried on with his life. Naruto took out his peach-manufactured eye tube, and made his way down the deserted hallways to his homeroom. He decided that it would be easier to deal with and less annoying, if he simply looked down and ignored what they were seeing. He advised against looking someone in the eyes since, for some reason, it simply makes them feel something, turning their normally composed visage into a hateful scowl. Perhaps he doesn't care. Perhaps he is a piece of shit. Perhaps he is an asshole. Perhaps this wasn't another universe. Perhaps it was hell, and he was being tortured for what he done. He might be a monster. It will all be over once he just has to put up with them for another year. It no longer matters and will never respond. He just needs to live up to the label they gave him. He will, and he might do it effortlessly. He could count on one hand the number of children that were utterly uninterested in him, even friendly, regardless of whether it was out of pity or some other negative emotion. But he could put up with those students who didn't care if they hated him or not. Naruto switched on his music and paused in front of his classroom door, surreptitiously opening it, even though his shinobi training allowed him to be as silent as the night. Unfortunately, it was his sensei, not him, who would still declare his presence. Uzumaki, late again today. Naruto removed his headphones and walked slowly over to his workstation in the back. His desk was littered with scribbles and scratches, as well as disparaging comments. He even threw away the used tissue that was on it, and gave the teacher a grunt. Tashima Naruto scowled at his most mischievous offspring, Uzumaki Naruto. The child was so absorbed in his own world that he slept and thought all day. Tashima still wanted to connect with the boy and see him succeed, even though the blonde was barely making enough progress to graduate from high school, and only obtain passing grades. The sensei was a tall, well-built, slightly overweight man who was impassioned, despite his gruff and often angry manner. He wore a blue shirt to school, had black hair, and just so happened to be concentrating on physical education. Naruto would have been an excellent athlete who could have excelled everyone else at this school, but Tashima could tell that he was physically healthy and exercised frequently. However, for some reason, he pretended to be somewhat above average in his class, and he never understood the mystery of Uzumaki Naruto. Even though he could have written Naruto off as late again, he went to his attendance log and wrote him as present instead of absent, since he had a soft spot for the child. Tashima didn't know what Tashima had noticed, but Naruto avoided everyone in the school, with a few exceptions, and his appearance, lack of emotion, and lack of expression weren't typical. Everything was bothering him so much that he knew he had to do something about it. What did Tashima believe he had to do? Although he was not aware of it, he could hear the students making fun of the child, and acting in an obviously harsh manner. Despite his best efforts, it failed throughout the first year. If it weren't for the teacher, Naruto would have been expelled long ago. It was unacceptable that he was usually late, at least twice or 3 times a week. Additionally, he had seen the child smoking, which is not permitted at a school that forbids tobacco usage. He covered for the blonde, although that may have caused serious problems for the organization on its own. Sometimes fate handled things horribly, but he wished he could do more to help him. He squeezed the bridge of his nose and moaned. "Takagi, please give him your notes after class for everything he missed," he asked. Tashima mentioned a girl who crossed her arms in contempt and scoffed a little. "But sensei, I don't even write notes, I just memorize anything you tell us that I don't already know," she responded. His eyebrows twitched, and Tashima looked at the second-place kid in the class. "Himejima, please give Uzumaki your notes after class," Tashima replied. With a lovely smile, the girl said, "Hi sensei," closing her pink eyelashes. Her voice was sweet and honey-like. Naruto's gaze strayed to the 2 identified pupils. Takagi Saya, a student at Kuo Academy, who called herself a genius, had every right to do so, because she had the best marks in the school, and, rumor has it, was ranked in the top 10 nationwide. Behind her piercing, golden eyes was a sharp mind. Her hair was wrapped up in 2 ponytails, and she had a lovely physique, small but still growing. He could see that she wasn't properly trained, even though she would have made a fantastic shinobi. Even if she had a mind as keen as Shikamaru's, he didn't want to speak to her because of her total authority. He evaluated Takagi Saya in his thoughts, a habit he had formed subconsciously to keep his mind occupied and prevent boredom, and then he focused on the other woman. The other female, Himejima Keno, was really beautiful. She was one of the 2 who accepted the disgraceful title of Great Ladies of Kuo. Under her stunning physique, there was a hint of combat-ready muscle tone. Another part of her just seemed to speak to his instincts, a kind of energy that was definitely not core energy. She had, of course, never mentioned this at all, and had kept it to herself. Her long black hair in a single ponytail almost irritated him. "You hear that, Uzumaki?" Make sure you copy those notes, and please don't be late again, his sensei said, turning back to him. Naruto rested his head against the desk and gazed out the right window. Hi sensei, he exclaimed out loud. Every time Tashima-sensei stated, please don't be late again, he nearly snorted, as if that would really happen. He couldn't understand why the man kept saying that, as if something would eventually shift and turn him into a flawless student. Naruto thought that he was being left on the street, where the dirt, rats, and insects would rip at his body and soul, and that his entire body was in a grinder. He had not slept well since entering this realm, and since waking up, therefore he was exhausted. It was impossible to change the past. Naruto then fell asleep. 0 The other students had already begun packing up, so he was lucky not to have to pack anything because he didn't unpack. He simply got up, grabbed his bag, put on his earbuds, and left the room when the noon bell rang. Oh, he didn't mean to fall asleep today, he said as he lifted his head and wiped his mouth of the drool. Ignoring Himejima-sen's attempt to hand him her papers, he kept walking with his eyes down, paying more attention to hips and feet than faces. He heard the fanboys and fangirls squealing with delight as one of the great ladies walked down the hall. What a farce. It wasn't too horrible, but he could hear some angry murmurs directed at him. He had heard his music at school, and he could see her coming. As she called his name and begged him to stay awake, Naruto simply grinned with delight. He was thinking, oh no, Himejima-san, I'm listening to music, and I can't hear you, or talk to you, ever. Now, please go away. Naruto accelerated his pace slightly to get further away from her without drawing attention to himself. I thought she would just let him go and not be too obstinate. Uzumaki-san. He tensed as the black-haired girl closed her hand around his wrist. Even though his body was battling on autopilot, he found it difficult to fight the urge. Akeno might have been a little annoyed, wondering if the blonde miscreant was deliberately ignoring her, or if he didn't hear her. As she passed the pupils, she heard the compliments she received and was as elegant and beautiful as before, always grinning. She had only ever spoken to the blonde once before, and from what she recalls, it was really rude and ended abruptly. As the blonde passed by, she was certain that he would be able to hear the terrible and blatantly rude things that some of the students were saying to him, or even whispering to him. She scowled at the delinquent's treatment. She yelled at him once again, a little louder than usual. She might have explained that she was only doing this because the teacher had told her to give him the notes, or that she had been searching for a reason to speak with him for some time. She had been interested in him since the opening ceremony, but the more she observed him, the more she wanted to speak with him directly. Only once, last year, when he had unintentionally run into her, had she spoken to him. She wasn't referring to what the world saw on a daily basis, but there was something odd, quite different about him. She had resisted the need to help, even though it might have been better to comply with his request. She was surprised, though, to see a pack of cigarettes on the floor close to everything, and she felt obliged to grab them and smoke them right away. The fact that their bag had thrown its contents over the floor really irritated him. He instructed her to move out of his way while muttering a few swears. She gave him a smile, picked them up, and held them out for him to receive. Naruto hesitated for only a second before taking them from her without saying thank you, and packing the rest of his suitcase. He may have been 5'10" when he stood up, and she was surprised by his height, but as his eyes met hers for a moment, she knew that something wasn't quite right about Uzumaki Naruto. And that was just what she was staring at once more. His eyes had the power to capture your interest, but not because they were attractive. Due to their extreme depression. For a while, she would see that look in a mirror every day, and it was sad to see someone with such lifeless eyes, for such a lovely color blue, to look so gray. Most people would say that his eyes were completely empty, devoid of any emotion, carefully hidden away behind a blank visage, but to her, to someone who had gone through something like this where she didn't want people to ask, she thought they were sad. Her gaze then moved to the shape of his face, which was angular but boyish, with stray stubble resting on his chin, surprising her a little at the facial hair. This time, she had finally noticed faint lines on his cheeks, 3 on each cheek, which almost looked like whisker marks, giving him this wild, almost exotic look. His eyebrows looked perfectly natural, so he didn't dye his hair at the time. Perhaps he could get a haircut and gain a tan, and if his blue eyes were truly blue and he smiled a little, she might see him as utterly handsome. Uzumaki Naruto was by no means an ugly person, but his messy hair and his awful empty face were a tremendous turnoff. Will you please relax? His voice, which had removed one of his headphones and was gripping it, was deep at one point, but not that deep. It was quiet and commanding, and it stopped her from thinking. I apologize, Uzumaki-san, Such unusual eyes just fascinated me, she continued, smiling and removing his wrist. After she let him go, Akeno observed that he was much calmer. Was he tense because he was terrified of being touched? Naruto remained silent for a long time before answering. Have you tried to deliver the notes to me? Akeno blinked, unable to comprehend what he was talking about, but then she recalled why she had gone to find him. She nearly flushed with shame at forgetting, mentally noting how he shifted the topic right away. Ah, yes, I was, she replied, taking her notes out of her bag. Save it, I wouldn't copy them anyway, he replied, with a raised hand to discourage her attempt. She grinned at him. But Uzumaki-san, you should worry more about your studies. I've heard some interesting things about you, and quite frankly, you don't look like half the idiot as some of the students like to call you. Others simply don't give a damn about school names like the great ladies of Kuo, but she was pretty sure that everyone knew who Uzumaki Naruto, the great delinquent of Kuo Academy, was. She also knew that talking to the blonde for personal reasons was social suicide, so she made sure to talk louder, so the students around her could hear her smile. Naruto was bothersome because of his aura. He was small, but if you look closely and pay attention, you might say that he was scary. Himejima Keno found Naruto unsettling because of his mannerisms, his knowledge of his surroundings, and his seeming complete indifference for everything that transpired around him. She smiled at him again, a bit gentler this time, saying, he seems to be an expert at ignoring what people think of him, and it worried me to be so used to such harsh remarks at such a young age, so she finds it surprising that he is able to handle so much of the school's mockery so well. I would like to get to know you as well, Uzumaki-san. Even though Naruto's face changed somewhat this time, she could still see it well, his eyes a bit bigger, his mouth slightly apart, and she could read it accurately enough to think it was a book. Naruto found it surprising. It must have been the first honest thing he had ever seen in her, the honest look on her face that matched her honest words. He was stunned at what she said, shocked that she had even started a civil conversation, shocked that she had even heard of him. Before tearing his eyes away from her, he blinked once and forced his face back into a bland gaze. Why would anyone want to do that, Himejima-san? Is there a problem with that? She inquired, smiling and tilting her head beautifully. It's starting to wear him down, so he nodded quickly before leaving in the hopes of avoiding everyone. Uzumaki-san, hold on. As he began to walk away from her, Akeno blinked and remarked, did my reaction bother you? She walked right by him and remained by his side, peering up at him. In an attempt to keep them apart, Naruto nodded once again. I don't want anyone to know me, ever, he said. Clearly enraged by her, Akeno scowled and spoke abruptly, saying, don't you sound evasive. It's quite unexpected for someone who appears to be so lonely. This time, she didn't think Naruto would stop moving altogether. His mind was suddenly filled with faces and images. His friends and family were all around him. Was he alone himself? In fact, loneliness was the only real connection he had to the people he had left behind, and the only thing that kept him sane. When they're all dead, how can he be let to live? The answer is straightforward. He isn't. If God weren't punishing him, he would surely feel alone. But it's not an issue. It's his salvation. Why is he permitted to have more friends and family after he killed them? Naruto straightened, ignoring Akeno's astonishment. He moved away from her and offered her a small cruel smile, trying not to frown. Goodbye, Himejima-san. Instead of turning back and leaving her there, he didn't walk slowly. No, he had to go since he didn't want friends and it didn't matter anymore. When everyone dies and moves on, why endure that suffering once more? With his fists clenched, he longed to turn around and speak to Himejima-san once more, but he would not acknowledge it. It took a great deal of willpower for him to decide to leave Akeno. He didn't understand. He simply wanted to go away. His eyes squinted and his chest tightened. He said, no, he won't, in closing. He refused to allow himself. He moaned, stuffed his hands in his pockets, and stepped outside. I guess it was true, he's not very good at a standing conversation yet. There are so many feelings that he just hasn't dealt with yet. Naruto was annoyed. He knew that he had handled that poorly, and he didn't need to take any frustration on Himejima-san. He was just stupid. A few boys were playing soccer on the track field, kicking the ball back and forth between themselves while they laughed. Naruto closed his eyes for a moment and felt the cool breeze on his face. It's such a lovely day. It felt like nature was rehashing past events as the wind blew across his blonde hair. He paused and looked about at all the high school kids who were laughing, smiling, and having a good time. For a moment, he was able to see Hyde Village in all its majesty, complete with buildings and the standing statue of the headmaster. He felt a tug on his lips, hardly able to contain a nostalgic smile, and his eyelids fluttered open as he tried to resist the wave of disappointment. Standing next to a tree on a slope close to the school building, he had a view of the tennis courts behind him and the students in the quad. It was neither home nor Hyde Village. He grinned less the more he observed the pupils having fun. He had a home, friends, family, and a future he could look forward to, and he knew what he was missing. This future motivated him to make it as perfect as possible. He wanted to live a peaceful life where his kids could play soccer like the kids in front of him. But that couldn't have been because he was the only one responsible. If he had been stronger, he would have seen it. He had suffered a tremendous deal because he had been too weak. He may even say that it would have been better for him to die. If he had given up, his friends would never have forgiven him, even though he could acknowledge that his current circumstances were not much better than death. Naruto took a seat and took out his sketchbook, sketching materials, and snacks. He took a bite out of it, then turned to a new page and glanced down at the boys playing soccer. They will serve as an inspiration to him. He could imagine himself as a kid playing with Hyde Vladimir, Mogi, and Yudin. Yes, that was a lot of fun. I wonder if any of them would approve of the way I'm coping right now, he thought, and then he drew a line. His own hand made the motion. After coming here, he created a number of clones and taught them all he knows about painting and drawing. In around a year, he learned artistic techniques that have been used for decades. He made every effort to preserve his recollections. He had never in his life wanted to wake up without a view of his house. He had to admit that this was something he had never been interested in before, and that he was not artistic. Naruto refused to let it go, wanting to see and remember their faces since, after all, that was all he had left of them. He possessed his ninja tools, such as shuriken and kunai, his old clothes, all of which were torn and tattered, and his scrolls, of which he was happily able to make more here. He had no photographs of his house, and it did not exist in this world. For a high school kid, it was just a passing notion. These paintings, his hit I-8, and the headband he had acquired from Iruka-sensei, the first to ever recognize him as Uzumaki Naruto instead of Kyuubi no Kitsune, were among his most treasured belongings. Right now, he couldn't bring himself to speak to that old jerk in public, but he couldn't blame Kurama anymore. One day, perhaps. He was working quickly on this design, finishing the contour and moving on to the details, when he heard a loud voice approaching him. He had never seen the person before. He didn't notice this individual till he heard them sit next to him. Since they didn't speak to each other, Naruto continued to ignore them. He could hear them walking around, taking out a notepad and writing something beside him. He fought the want to ask a few questions. He didn't realize till they gave him a shoulder pat. He looked up from his doodle and glanced at the intruder. She was a girl and pretty. Her hair was light pink brownish, slightly wavy, and reached the middle of her back. Her eyes were rich brown and inviting. She was small, but she had a nice bust, even if Naruto would contend that it would have been typical for high school girls except for those at this particular high school, where it appeared that having a reasonably large bust size was the norm. When she took out her notepad, Naruto was chewing her lip in a nervous yet adorable way. His gaze strayed to the paper and he read what she had written for him. I apologize for interrupting, and it's nice to meet you. My name is Nishimiya Shako, and I come here every day for lunch. After reading the paper, Naruto turned to face her, wondering whether she was mute, why she was writing to him, or if there was another reason why she couldn't speak. He glanced down at the page again and read the words she had written for him. I'd like to be your friend. Reminiscent of himself, at least as a child, Naruto almost grinned at her candor as she put down the book and sat on the opposite side of the tree. Naruto grabbed his pencil and played with it while looking back at the field. My name is Uzumaki Naruto, I hope we can get along, he added, nodding his head back at her. Naruto turned back to the girl, who appeared somewhat perplexed and ashamed. This time, she gave him her notepad, and Naruto glanced at the page. He wasn't anticipating another tap on his shoulder, but he was anticipating a response from her, perhaps one of contempt or humiliation. Sorry, could you say it again? I can read lips, but I can't hear. He didn't glance at her as he began writing with his own pencil, since it nearly made him freeze. This caught him off guard. He wasn't even sure if he had heard of any deaf people in the elemental nations, but he could imagine the struggles they must have endured. I'm hoping we can move forward. My name is Uzumaki Naruto. After giving the notebook back, he assessed her reaction. She glanced at the paper and blinked in surprise. Naruto smiled slightly at him, as if she knew who he was. Though he didn't care anything, he believed that everyone in this school had heard about him. Before presenting the paper to him, she began writing on it. To read the lines. Does the criminal history of Uzumaki Naruto the Kuo exist? Shako made O with her mouth before she started writing again, and Naruto shook his head in agreement as he perspired uncomfortably and then chuckled. I expected you to look more threatening. He didn't realize the paper was there until, for the first time in his 3 years of life, someone spoke to him like a human being. Naruto actually gave her a small but sincere smile before he reached for the notepad, and she gave it to him. As he looked at the page, his shoulders appeared oddly relieved. If you wanted me to be frightening, I could be. When he showed it to her, she nervously chewed her lip and then shook her head no. Before jotting something down once again, Naruto looked at her, felt her tap his shoulder, and smiled gently. She was nodding her head no while pretending to write, and Naruto scowled as she pointed to her lips. This is how you want me to speak to you? Naruto asked her, turning to face her. She nodded and smiled, and he scowled before carrying on with her notebook writing. Why are you unable to hear? He gave it back to her, and Shako looked at the question silently before slowly entering a response. She gave Naruto a faint, dejected smile that made it obvious that she detested being deaf, even though there was nothing he could do about it. I had severe hearing loss from birth, which led to my classification as clinically deaf. Dreamful hearing loss, he said, must be such a burden. When he read that, Naruto frowned and said, deaf. Since he is well versed in burdens, he knew that she wouldn't want to be pitied, and even when he thought about that, he realized that he would have hated it if he had been in her shoes. He had never heard of such a thing, so far. Instead, he merely gave her a soft smile and murmured, "I'm sorry to hear that," being careful to communicate clearly. Naruto took a few more bites out of his own sandwich before he resumed painting, then turned to face the lads who were playing soccer, and were now taking a break and eating their sandwiches. He may have felt that their comfortable stillness was awkward because of the barrier between them, but he was obviously referring to the fact that they could only interact by writing in a notebook. The company, however, was more than enough for him, and they didn't need to converse. He was nearly finished viewing the picture when he felt a second hand on his shoulder. He turned up to see Nishimiya-san, a shy-looking girl with a notebook in her hand. "You're doing fantastic, and the picture is lovely." With a gentle smile, Naruto extended his own hand. There were Mogi, who this time gestured to the only girl in the photo, who was pouting and appeared extremely upset about something, despite the fact that her face was slightly flushed with embarrassment. Hyde Vladimer, who gestured to a boy with a long scarf around his neck in a humorous pose. And Yuden, who gestured to another boy with glasses and a sickly expression, who was grinning softly and holding a cardboard box above his head. Naruto put his palm on his stomach and grinned softly as he gestured at the three of them, after he had finally drawn himself up beside Hyde Vladimer. "Are you the final one?" Naruto turned to Nishimiya after taking a quick look at the page, nodding slightly, and pointing to himself. "Yeah, the last one is me. I was much younger then," he said. "You now appear to be a lot happier." Naruto read the words, glanced down at his picture, scrawled in the bottom corner, and then grinned, but it was a melancholy one, and his eyes were watering. At the moment, I was rather satisfied. When she offered him the sketch, he simply shook his head and waved her away, as if to say that she could keep it. Shako then placed the sketch in her bag before she began writing again. Naruto tore the paper out of his sketchbook before giving it to her, and she appeared surprised that he had done so. How did they fare? Naruto had no idea how to answer such a question. He couldn't simply tell her that 3 of his friends had died along with nearly everyone he loved, but what else could he say? He could joke and see if she laughed, or he could tell a half-truth. Before writing something down for her to read, Naruto requested the notebook once more. I relocated a considerable distance away. Before writing in the journal, she scowled, bowed her head, and made strange hand gestures. That's unfortunate to hear. When the lunch bell rang, Naruto groaned to himself, grinned at her, and waved to the girl, Nishimiya-san, before packing his belongings in his bag and getting to his feet. He was about to pass her again when a hand snagged his sleeve, and he cocked an eyebrow in confusion before going back to Shako, who appeared to be concerned about something before quickly writing something down in her lovely handwriting. "Is it possible for us to have lunch here tomorrow?" He knelt down in front of her and placed a hand on her head, causing the girl to blush slightly, but still maintain eye contact with him. Naruto blinked for a moment, and the girl's face changed from that of his former love and teammate to that of Nishimiya. He felt his smile falter a little before he ignored it. Naruto read the line again, then smiled slowly, this time gently, and he felt as though it was a genuine smile. He muttered, "I hope to see you again, Nishimiya-san," and said, "Yeah, I'll be back for lunch tomorrow," a bit too softly, but clearly enough for her to comprehend. Feeling much better than he had in a long time, he got up, carried his backpack, and went to his classroom, thinking that maybe it wouldn't be such a horrible idea to let a few people into his life as acquaintances or maybe friends. Since he had a soft spot for special cases and Nishimiya-san wasn't a bad girl, he walked through the crowd, lowering his eyes and putting his earbuds back in, ignoring the look he was getting from the girl he had just left behind. It seemed like she had had a difficult life up to this point, and he found it difficult not to relate to that. Perhaps he should go speak with Akeno-san one more. He would take notes and apologize, sparing her from Toshima-sensei's anger. He arrived at the classroom a little early, not anticipating Akeno sitting at her desk immediately. After thinking about waiting for her outside in the hallway, he chose to go in before her. Naruto made the decision to seize the chance to speak with the stunning woman with the raven hair. Akeno turned to look around when Naruto walked up to her and clumsily cleared his throat without turning to face her. To his slight surprise, he saw a mortified and rather ashamed Naruto standing in front of her. "I hope you can forgive me for my rudeness earlier, Himejima-san," he replied, bowing slightly. This may still be the case with him, but if he were to come back an hour later and apologize for his actions, then he had been conscious of his feelings the entire time, and had just made the decision to act the way he had. Akeno gaped openly at the tall boy, surprised to say the least, and he gave a negative response, because the blonde in front of him was pushed to the point where we were unable to emotionally register her intentions. It was amusing to see such a reaction from someone like him, but it was odd that she couldn't help but smile even if she wanted to, even if he had changed his mind, and apologize for his cunning behavior during the time she didn't see him. "It's alright, Uzumaki-san, I hope I didn't upset you earlier with any comments I had made. When she wasn't playing, she was very beautiful." Naruto heard the door behind him open, but he couldn't bring himself to turn around and glanced up at her, blushing a little as he blinked at her genuine smile. "Oh no, I just wasn't in the best of moods, and I realized that I was being a dick," he said, still clearing his throat and scratching the back of his neck. Before she cocked her head, he heard her laugh softly. Are you a cranky boy?" "I wouldn't say that," Naruto said, glaring and staring again. When the first few students arrived, Akeno opened her eyes and gathered herself. Naruto watched her giggle into her palm once again as she closed her eyes, her hand appearing soft and beautiful. "If it is convenient for you, I may deliver the notes to you after school." He wrinkled his nose in disdain and murmured, "Oh, yeah, the notes," because, to be honest, he had forgotten about them and, despite his terrible feelings about what he had done, he still wanted to take the damn notes. He replied, frowning slightly as he heard the Ravenet giggle behind him once more, perhaps teasing him, and waved over his shoulder as he returned to his desk, ignoring the other kids. "I guess so, I'll see you at the entrance after school," he said. When he nearly ran into Takagi Saya, the class representative, who was practically glaring at him while holding a notepad out for him and a hand on her hip, Naruto stopped staring at the girl in front of him with an owlish expression. "I had written these notes over lunch. The notes are everything that sensei had gone over that will most likely be on any tests. Seeing as you aren't the smartest, I had made them simple and easy enough for you to understand," Saya said, letting out a sigh, pressing the notebook into his chest, crossing her arms, and turning her head. Wondering why she would do this, Naruto snatched up the notepad and looked at the cover. "Because, idiot, I am the class rep, and I should take responsibilities such as this into my power. Himejima-sen shouldn't be bothered with giving out her notes," Saya responded. He asked himself, did he really say it aloud? As he glanced over his shoulder at Akeno-san, who was usually quite skilled at concealing her frown. He didn't believe he did. Naruto returned to Saya and gave him a small smile while nodding his head. "I will immediately write them in writing." "Thank you, Yinchu," he murmured, walking past her and sitting at his desk in the back. After glaring at him as he passed, Saya turned to face Akeno, who gave her a seductive glance before sitting down in the center of the classroom to prepare and gather her belongings. Akeno, who had long sensed that the Takagi girl was not a big fan, did the same. She wasn't sure if this was because the genius girl was envious of her or because she was intimidated by her, but she could feel that it was something much more serious than jealousy. Although she couldn't be certain of her motives or even if her supposition was true, she thought it was quite strange that she had chosen to assist Naruto based on what she had said in class. It appeared as though this one action had been an attempt to re-establish a barrier between Naruto and Akeno. The students were clearly using him as a kind of personal diversion, and it was a little awkward, and he nearly started to perspire at the intense look they were giving him at the moment. Tashima entered his classroom to find everyone seated and ready to go, and he felt some tension, though he wasn't sure what had happened. He blinked and noticed that the blonde's head was down, and that he was writing something in a notebook, perhaps some notes at last. He looked to the back of the room and saw that Naruto was, for once, in his seat and on time. He smiled excitedly, hoping that Naruto would finally take his life a little more seriously than he had previously. Perhaps he could further pique the boy's interest with a good lesson to start things off right now. "Alright, class. I hope your lunch break was enjoyable, and welcome back." In addition, he offered to review antiderivative and indefinite integrals that some of you might have had trouble understanding yesterday. "If you have any questions, please feel free to ask, or even write them down and come to me after class," he said. The blonde didn't even glance up at him. "Now let's begin," he said, picking up a pen and writing on his whiteboard. Naruto moaned as the day's end bell rang, and they were instructed to go from this legal torture dungeon. He had seen enough people for one day and was tired, so he hurriedly packed his things and walked out of the room, determined to leave for the day. Too many individuals, not enough time for them. Before most of the students arrived at the entrance, he hurriedly changed out of his school shoes and put on his sneakers. He opened the door and was taken aback by the shock, which caused him to step back as though he had been bumped into. He glanced down at the man who had struck him, after hearing the boy moan from where he was lying on the ground. Naruto looked at the dark-haired boy with a small mullet. He had an unremarkable build and appeared about normal for his height. The lad moaned from the ground and looked up at the person he had run into. "What the devil? I apologize, Uzumaki-san. I had no idea where I was heading. Please pardon me, or at the very least, don't beat me up." The sight of Naruto's face before him caused his brown eyes to enlarge. Then, with his head practically touching the floor, the lad shrieked and tumbled to Naruto's feet in a Caesar stance. Before he could respond, a number of girls in towels or bikinis were sneaking around the corner, making Naruto's mouth tremble uncomfortably. He blanched, wondering what in the world was going on. As they reached the corner, they all began pointing and shouting at him or the other person, as if they had sensed something, and then they ran at them both with all their vigor. Sweat-drenched, the brunette on the ground squeaked once more and rose, and Naruto felt a chill he hadn't experienced in a long time, a little uneasy at the throng of irate women running at them, so he raised his eyebrows, and then glanced down at the frightened man, asking himself, is every man for himself? Or, taking the boy by the hand, he put him over his back and knelt down, declaring, I will never desert a comrade in need. Oh, what are you doing, Uzumaki-san? The brunette shouted frantically. Naruto glanced at him and said, we're leaving. Was all that he muttered before starting to run, keeping it as humanly fast as he could, because he knew that many people would question him later about how the fuck he was able to use shinobi speeds here, but Naruto wasn't interested in any of that. However, carrying this other guy on his back while racing the swarm of irate women brought back memories of his time running a train and carrying a princess, and yes, that was a fun time. For a while, he hurried about the school, attempting to convince the extremely tenacious bunch to stop, but eventually, they all stopped out of tiredness and returned to their regular activities. Whoa, he hasn't pushed himself this hard in a long time. He was panting and trying to regain his breath behind the tennis courts, next to a woodland, and, if he was right, close to the old school building. He has been pondering for the past 3 years without really practicing. After wiping the perspiration from his cheeks, he glared at the brunette, and then turned to confront the boy who had been the source of his problems. What the devil was going on? The child looked at him for a moment, then got back up and bowed too fast for a healthy back. Thank you, Uzumaki-senpai. You are the best. Without you, I would have been completely destroyed. Naruto let out a frustrated groan and rubbed his neck. It's fine, I can't believe they even started chasing me, he said. The child appeared contemptuous. Well, given your reputation, Uzumaki-senpai, I truly thought they'd have stopped chasing me after they saw you. As he stroked his matted hair, Naruto whispered, it's whatever. But again, who are you? Oh? I had overlooked that I'm Haidou-sei, Uzumaki-senpai, and I apologize if this has caused you any trouble, the child replied, straightening up. As Naruto gazed at Issei and realized what had happened, a piece of the event began to piece itself together in his memory. Haidou-san. You're one of those perverts. Do you know who I am? Issei asked, seeming shocked. Naruto shuddered at the idea. The child's perversion might even be comparable to that of his late sensei, based on what he had learned about the perverted trio, but he didn't even deny that he was one. They might even be similar to the super pervert. He said, I've heard of you and your buddies, which clarified why the girls were after you. Swim club. They just started warm-ups in those delicious school swimsuits, Issei agreed enthusiastically. He smiled as he visualized them in great detail, his nose widening and his face reddened. Before picking up his bag from the floor and beginning to wipe off the dirt, Naruto shook his head and laughed quietly at the expression, which he was too accustomed to from his life to be influenced by now. Issei called Naruto's attention to himself and stated, you know, Uzumaki-senpai. Issei scratched his cheek sheepishly, while Naruto simply arched a pale eyebrow. I've heard a lot of bad things about you, but you aren't anything like what the rumors say about you, Issei responded. Naruto joked, who knows? I'm not interested in that sort of thing, grinning mischievously. Issei smiled at him and remarked, you really saved me there today, when she said, well, I'm sorry that you get so much shit then, I hope one day they'll see how cool you really are, she added. Replied Naruto, like I said, it's no problem, but I doubt the school will be able to see me any different anytime soon, I'm already in my 3rd year anyway. Issei looked at him and said, well, maybe if you act this way with everyone, then they'll see. Naruto said, it wouldn't be as easy as that, Haidou-san, people get set into their ideas, and it's hard to get them to acknowledge their wrongdoing, especially if some of them have been doing it for multiple years. But, the blonde remarked, that's just how it works, especially in this world, sometimes you just have to suck it up and accept your loss, as Issei didn't seem to be persuaded by Naruto. Before Issei could say another word, Naruto began to move away. He threw a hand over his shoulder and said, take care, Haidou-san. He put his hands in his pockets as he heard Issei bid farewell to his leaving body. He was exhausted after the long day. Usually he could wait until he got home, but today was exhausting, and he felt the want to smoke all of a sudden. Instead of lighting a lighter, he lit a small flame above his thumb with a very low-level cadence spear dart, took out the packet, put a stick between his lips, and took a deep puff, feeling the hot dry smoke enter his lungs. The burning sensation was so relieving that it gave him an odd sense of calm. He extinguished the smoke before he could look around, seeing only the structure he had been standing in front of, surrounded by a forest of trees, with stairs leading up to the front entrance, which was crowned by a huge clock. Although it had a new metal roof on top, it appeared to be pretty ancient. For the first time since he had been there, he noticed anything that stopped him from taking another drag at that moment. His eyes were still fixed on the open window, where a figure was standing and staring at him. He had the appearance of a deer in headlights. Dashima-sensei once smelled smokes on Naruto, who had never smoked at school before, and threatened to deport him right away if he tried to smoke on school property again. They seemed to be really concerned about these matters. But for the moment, he was unable to turn away from this lady. She simply stood there, staring at him with a passive expression on her face, and even from a distance, he could practically feel her disappointment. She had a massive bust, nearly as big as a Keno's. Her delicate hand was grasping the windowsill. Her eyes were gorgeous blue-green. Her hair was long, untamed, and crimson. It was lovely red hair. Her angular face and high cheekbones gave her a sophisticated appearance. She held herself like royalty. In front of her, Naruto took a drag after taking out the cigarette and lighting it with a cadence spirit art. To be honest, the cadence spirit art was the thing that scared him the most. Even if his elevator didn't make it to the top floor, Naruto wasn't stupid enough to miss this individual. Being a stunning girl who was in and out and upside down, she was one of the two great ladies of Kuo Academy. Knowing that she had a lot of authority in Kuo Academy and Kuo Town and was close to the student council, he was a little concerned about what had happened at this precise moment. Yes, he was well aware of this individual. Yes, Grimmery.